Among the men of Easy Company, the name David Webster often stirred complicated reactions. Years after the war, when veterans began reading drafts of Band of Brothers, several wrote to historian Stephen Ambrose expressing concern that Webster occupied too much space in the story of the company. To many of them, it seemed strange that a man who had spent portions of the war away from the front because of wounds and hospitalization had become one of the defining voices of Easy Company. Part of the reason was simple. Webster had written everything down, unlike many of the men who returned home after the war and tried to leave combat behind them. Webster had preserved his memories in vivid detail. His diaries and manuscripts gave Ambrose something few veterans could provide decades later, scenes reconstructed almost moment by moment, filled with sounds, smells, fragments of dialogue, and the private thoughts of a young paratrooper trying to make sense of chaos. Webster did not write like a soldier recounting operations. He wrote like a novelist wandering through a nightmare. Some of the men admired that talent, others distrusted it. In a letter written in July 1991, Jim Alley tried to explain his feelings to Ambrose. He insisted he had nothing personal against Webster. In fact, after the war, Webster had visited him several times in Southern California, and the two had always gotten along well. Alley remembered Webster as intelligent, reserved, and different from most of the men in the company. He described him as a writer and an intellectual, someone more comfortable observing events than immersing himself in the rough camaraderie that defined Easy Company. Webster had even given Alley a decorative plate he had designed himself, a gift Alley still treasured years later. Yet Alley still believed Ambrose had leaned too heavily on Webster's memories. After all, he pointed out, he wasn't on the line that much. That sentiment echoed through many of the letters Ambrose received. To veterans who had endured months of continuous combat, Webster's prominence felt disproportionate. Some believed men who had remained at the front from Normandy through Germany deserved greater attention than the thoughtful Harvard student who wrote beautifully about war, but often seemed detached from the group itself. Even Richard Winters struggled with Webster's style. Winters, who valued clarity, discipline, and factual precision, found parts of Webster's memoir Parachute Infantry baffling. In his notes, he criticized Webster's account of fighting in Holland, particularly the dreamy and fragmented way he described actions that had involved entire battalions over the course of days. Winters could not understand how someone who had truly witnessed those events could portray them in such an almost surreal fashion. To him, it felt less like military history and more like fiction. But that strange quality was exactly what made Webster memorable. While most veterans wrote about tactics, heroism, or camaraderie, Webster focused on exhaustion, fear, loneliness, mud, rain, and the surreal absurdity of war. His prose drifted between observation and reflection, capturing moments other soldiers rarely described aloud. He noticed the shape of clouds over bombed fields, the smell of wet wool after a march, the strange silence that sometimes settled over men before battle. Reading Webster often felt less like hearing a soldier tell war stories, and more like entering the mind of a man slowly trying to survive both physically and emotionally. To many officers, however, Webster could be difficult. Robert Brewer remembered him as argumentative and intellectually provocative, even during training at Camp Toccoa. Webster's habit of asking sharp, highly technical questions during classes irritated junior officers who already struggled to maintain authority over fiercely independent paratroopers. Brewer recalled moments when Webster seemed almost determined to challenge the system, simply to see how it reacted. After Normandy, tensions increased. One day, while officers were censoring outgoing mail, a superior discovered that Webster had included detailed organizational information about Headquarters Company in a letter to his mother. Whether he intended it as carelessness, rebellion, or merely intellectual amusement was unclear, but the act infuriated officers responsible for security. Brewer was tasked with speaking to him privately, trying to break through Webster's detached attitude. Brewer told him something many combat officers quietly believed, that once they returned to battle, they all had to assume they were already dead. It was a way of hardening oneself against fear. The next day, Webster wrote home again, calmly informing his mother that he was already dead. There was nothing to censor in that. Moments like that became part of Webster's legend within the company. Some men found him arrogant, others found him darkly funny. Nearly all agreed he was unlike anyone else in Easy Company. He had always been different. Even before the war, Webster dreamed not of glory, but of England itself. As a child, Fascinated by British literature and Scottish history, he imagined sailing across the Atlantic on great black ships and wandering through the countryside described in the poetry and adventure stories he loved. His parents, proud of their English and Scottish ancestry, dressed him almost like a storybook child, and he spent hours playing with toy soldiers in kilts while imagining distant battlefields. 1943 finally crossed the Atlantic, though not in the romantic fashion he once imagined. Instead of a grand voyage of discovery, he boarded a crowded troop ship packed with nervous paratroopers bound for war. The crossing was quiet and grim. There were no cheering crowds at the docks, no bands playing patriotic songs, only weary stevedores and Red Cross volunteers handing out coffee and donuts before departure. Webster watched New York disappear behind him as the ship moved slowly toward open water, carrying him toward England and eventually toward Normandy. War changed him, but it also sharpened the qualities already inside him. He remained observant, introspective, and strangely detached, as though part of him always stood outside events recording them. After the war, Webster tried to build a life through writing. He worked as a journalist and technical writer while continuing to chase subjects that fascinated him. One of those obsessions became sharks. To Webster, sharks represented something ancient and unknowable about the sea, creatures both terrifying and beautiful. He spent years researching them, sailing alone off the California coast in a small 12-foot boat he named Tusitala, Teller of Tales. He swam with sharks, studied them firsthand, and eventually wrote a non-fiction manuscript exploring the myths surrounding them. Yet publisher after publisher rejected the work. Nearly 30 houses turned it down, convinced readers would never care about sharks. On September 9, 1961, Webster sailed out from Santa Monica carrying squid bait, fishing tackle, and heavy shark lines. He intended to spend the day fishing offshore before returning home that afternoon. He never came back. Search crews later found his small boat drifting miles from shore, partially flooded, with its fishing equipment still inside. One oar was gone. The tiller was missing. There was no sign of Webster himself. His wife, Barbara, waited desperately on the beach as lifeguards, Coast Guard helicopters, airplanes, and fishing boats searched the water until darkness forced them to stop. No trace of him was ever found. 2 years later, Barbara succeeded in getting his shark manuscript published under the title Myth and Maneater. By then, Webster himself had already begun slipping into legend. The thoughtful paratrooper who wrote war-like literature, challenged authority without fear, survived Europe, and then vanished alone into the Pacific chasing sharks. If you have read David Webster's book Parachute Infantry, do you think that his portrayal in Band of Brothers closely followed his memoirs? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.